the title of the talk that Samir, I'll just say he picked. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was somebody else, but it wasn't I who picked it. But it's a good title, but it focuses on this complicated international relations term. It's kind of an IR theory term, which is not how I would usually start out in Washington. So the offense-defense balance. And the argument that I'm going to make is that the offense-defense balance is changing, but I think I probably ought to start by telling what is the offense-defense balance and why that might matter. So the intuition behind the offense-defense balance is it's an argument that says sometimes it's easier militarily to go on the offense and win, and sometimes it's easier, relatively speaking, to be on the defense and win. So things change over time that might make it harder or easier to win when you attack someone. And that could be technology changes. It could be when you think across different scenarios, the geography is different in different areas. Some are suited to the attack and some are not suited to the attack. It could be other factors that change how easy it is to go on the offense. So different types of training or the effectiveness of training, the realisticness of training, all of these things can have an effect on whether it's easier or harder to go on the offense militarily. That's the intuition of what the offense-defense balance is. And academically, there's been debate on whether there is one offense-defense balance. Is this some global thing that applies universally wherever people might fight, that it gets harder or easier to attack people? I think that's largely dismissed, right? It's certainly not what I want to talk about. It's not the idea that there's one global offense-defense balance. But if you think about, in particular scenarios, particular countries that might want to fight each other for particular reasons over particular stakes, you can think sometimes it's harder for the offense and sometimes it's easier for the offense. This also happens at different levels of conflict, right? It could be strategically that it's hard to mobilize a country. It's easier, or you could say it's easier to mobilize a country defensively than offensively because of nationalism, right? People don't like to get conquered and enslaved, and so it's easier to get them wound up to fight for their defense than to go fight trying to take over somebody else's country where the nationalism's on the other side. That's like a strategic variable that affects, or strategic concept that affects how easy it is to fight on the offense versus the defense. I'm mostly going to talk about technology as a variable and at the operational level of war. So not that question of how riled up your country gets and can you convince people in Congress to vote to declare war, those kinds of things. I'm going to talk about how technology affects the relative ease or not of conquering other countries. And in particular, I'm interested in East Asia, but I think the same thing, in particular, the technology influences I'm going to talk about probably do travel. You have to think about different dyads, think about different scenarios where it might or might not apply. But my guess is that these things, the effects I'm going to talk about today, or the causes I'm going to talk about today, also apply in South Asia, in the full Indo-Pacific. So formally, when academics talk about the offense-defense balance, they talk about the cost of developing offensive forces to overcome a particular defensive deployment. So the relative cost of investing in the offense versus the defense. It's very hard to do full-on cost estimates of a particular force structure, but it's easy. The thing I'm going to talk about today is relative changes. So I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to price out how much would it cost China to conquer Taiwan or something like that. What I'm going to talk about is it getting more or less costly for that to take place? Oh, right, we can get another screen. Nice.
Technology.
But so we're just going to assess the shift, the direction of the shift. So I mentioned two particular factors that I'm going to emphasize. They're the narrowest factors, the most structural factors, the ones that almost everyone agrees belong as part of the operational offense-defense balance, geography and technology. So I'm going to say a word about geography in the Indo-Pacific and why it's interesting, and then talk about the technologies. So academically, thinking about the offense-defense balance has fallen out of favor. It's not how most policy people think either. It's kind of abstract. But it's fallen out of favor based on studies where the studies in the past of the offense-defense balance focused on land warfare and nuclear weapons issues. And there's a big theoretical debate about nuclear weapons issues. We don't have too many examples of nuclear wars, fortunately, where we can assess what were the relative costs of offense and defense. So people think theoretically about that. And then people look to history of land warfare to figure out, was it really true that the offense was easier in World War II than it was in World War I? Questions like there's lots of experience. And people have poked holes. They've said it's very hard to decide whether things favor the offense or the defense on the land. Because, for example, if you build the Maginot Line over here because you think things are very defensive, you can guard that flank with fewer guys, which opens up more ability for you to put guys over here while your home is protected by the Maginot Line to go hit people, to go out on the offense, right? So there's a problem distinguishing offensive and defensive postures or offensive and defensive investments in land warfare. The problem is people haven't been thinking about the offense-defense balance with respect to other scenarios. So the scenarios we face particularly in East Asia and South Asia, I'm just adding that in, where we're concerned about not just land, but land versus sea and air. Lots of the action, particularly if you go on the offense in Asia, ends up operationally in the sea or on the sea and in the air as opposed to on the land. In fact, usually it's someone coming across the sea or flying through the air going against someone whose forces on defense are on the land. And so you want to think about, there's a key contrast between the technologies, the effective geography on military technology when you're in the sea and air compared to on the land, which is these key factors, cover, concealment, and clutter, really favor people on land compared to people in the sea and in the air. So, concealment, if you're going to fight, you like not to be seen by the enemy, because if the enemy sees you, they could try to kill you. But if you're not visible, if you're concealed and you get to shoot at the enemy or move around or jujitsu them or whatever it is you're going to do, concealment is a big advantage. Well, so if you're on the land, there are all kinds of limitations to line of sight for sensors, right? There could be a hill in the way. You could dodge out behind it. There's the curvature of the earth that makes it hard to see in a certain distance, or there could be a mountain, or various things that mess up your ability to see, a road bed, something like that on the land. But the surface of the ocean, very different. Basically flat, nothing to hide behind. Concealment is very different. In the air, even more difficult. Like from visual spectrum, sometimes if you're lucky, you can come out of the clouds and get the other guy in a dogfight, but that's not a very reliable position operationally. That's at a tactical level, right? But there's not opportunities for concealment in the sea and the air. In fact, the way people have hidden in the past in the sea and the air is the great expanse. They've been lost in, we don't know where to look because the ocean's so damn big, you might not be able to find the other guys who you're fighting against. It's not that they're hidden in plain sight, it's just space is what matters. And we're going to see that technology affects that. Cover, similarly, the ingress route for attack, so it could be just a projectile or even a missile, right? If the missile is designed to fly over the sea or just up into the air, it can't navigate terrain obstacles the same, or it would have more difficulty. You'd have to program it differently to navigate terrain obstacles on the land than if you're fighting in the sea or the air, where there are not terrain obstacles, right? Just the operational significance of technology is different, and it's harder to fight on the land. And then clutter, the number of non-target objects, like if you're trying to decide what to shoot at, there's a whole lot more stuff on the land than in the sea and the air. So you have a different distinguishability problem, a different problem finding your targets. It's harder to kill stuff on land than to kill stuff at sea and in the air because you can find them much more easily. And the source of false positives is different. If you're trying to program a sensor system to find the right stuff on the sea, you're worried about, say, radar scatter, bounce back from wave action and things like that. It's a very different process of creating the clutter than worrying about private cars and trucks on the roads or forest cover or that kind of stuff that's on the land. You would use a very different set of technologies to address the problems of finding targets at sea compared to on the land, right? That's the effective geography. So what does this have to do with technology? Well, the technology trajectory recently, the big thing that's happening, we're talking about better sensors, better data fusion, new ways of computer processing, new ways of delivering precision fires that are changing warfare. But they change warfare differently in the ground, in the land, compared to the sea and the air. So when we see an important source of sensor improvement. So I've got these two graphics. I'm not going to point at them because they're on 3 different screens. But on the audience left, this is a graphic from the American military that the cooperative engagement capability system uses to show the effect of data fusion. So if you can use modern computing capability, it used to be, here, let me phrase it this way. It used to be that a weapon system, in order to take a shot, had to have directly connected, it had one radar or one set of sensor to see where it was going to shoot. And it took a shot when it could see, and it was very limited. Its ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions or to combine data from different observation directions, who had a best chance of seeing as opposed to who had a best chance of shooting at a particular target might not be the same. But old weapon systems which didn't have good data fusion and had limited sensors couldn't handle that scenario. The thing that's been changing is computing technology is now cheap and there are more different kinds of sensors available, is that we can combine sensor information and pick who's the best shooter to take advantage of the combined sensor track. So you can see, I'm pointing, but I could point the same over there, right? You could see each of those 3 ships has a partial sensor picture of where an incoming airplane is. None of them individually could take the picture, but if you have good data processing and so you can combine their sensor capabilities, you can get a complete data track and somebody can take a shot. That's a technology that's changing that the United States has started to really figure out recently, and now over time other countries are also starting to figure out, right? That's a technology change with sensors and data distribution, and it can lead to, the other picture. This is a land-based mobile anti-ship cruise missile. If this thing gets sensor data somehow on something that's getting easier and easier to see on the water, this thing can shoot at it and potentially kill it, but this thing is on the land where it can hide, where the clutter situation is different, and where it can take cover. That means that it's hard for the things at sea to kill the land-based anti-ship cruise missile using the new technologies, but it's much more advantageous. The thing on the land is getting better at finding and shooting at the thing that's on the water or in the air. So that's the technology trajectory we're talking about. And I would say this increasingly favors the defense, right? So the trajectory of technology that's enabling better sensing, better shooting as a result of sensors and data fusion is helping those land-based defensive systems that are relatively survivable do a better and better job of killing things on the sea surface or in the air trying to hide behind clouds that are trying to come bomb you. And so you can fend them off with land-based systems better and better. And of course that has huge implications if you're in the Indo-Pacific region where defenders are on the land and attackers are on the sea and in the air. So why is it the case that this sensor and data fusion revolution increasingly favors the defense? Well, here's 2 key arguments. So the first thing is, if you take a system like this, you can build portable radars and take them on the road with you and have multiple radars that try to communicate with each other and fuse data. But that's very difficult because you're not familiar with your own location, with the normal clutter and background where you are. As you move around, you lose the ability to train your system on what is normal, because what's abnormal is the attacker coming to shoot you with a missile or something like that. What you're looking for is things that stand out against normal background. And if you're at home and you know what the normal scene looks like, or if you train your data processing algorithm on the day-to-day, every day when you don't get attacked, it stands out much more if you know that normal day-to-day scene than if you try to take it on the road and drive your system to a place you're unfamiliar with and then use the same technology for defense. So this system, the new sensors, are better at home on defense than on the road on offense. It's also the case that given that the other guy's shooting at you, one of the things you want to do to keep your radars alive, to keep your shooters alive, is you want to move them around. You want to have decoys. You want to have jammers. All of these things mixed into this electronic picture that would also degrade your own ability to do surveillance because you're jamming yourself at the same time you're jamming the other guy. But if you've designed the system at home so that you can take account in your signal processing of when you're jamming and which system you're turning on to try to see the enemy at a particular time, if you know more about your own system, you can take account of the jamming in your signal processing in a way that the attacker cannot, right? So that helps the defense. Similarly, defenders get the usual advantages of being on land while the attackers are in the air and sea. And the main thing is you can have a lot more space. You can have a lot more sensors in different locations. You can design the optimal locations. When you're at sea, you're a come-as-you-are force. Or when you're in the air, you're in this little airplane, and you have to bring, if you want to bring a radar, you get to only bring one, and you have a limited number of munitions in your plane. You can't carry that much stuff. And every time you put in another system that helps keep yourself alive, that helps defend yourself from the other guy, you have to make space for that by giving up some of your own striking power. On the land, that's not the case. So like if we fill up a destroyer with a whole bunch of air defense missiles to defend the battle group, that destroyer can't also, in the same amount of space, have a whole bunch of land attack missiles for its strike mission. The more you have to defend, you degrade your ability to accomplish your mission, right? That's not true on the land. You can have both a defensive system and a system trying to accomplish your mission effectiveness, because you just build them next to each other, or you drive them around, or you've got all the space to have a giant warehouse full of munitions, or whatever it is that you need. So the fact is that the more you have to worry about carrying defensive systems with yourself to go on the attack, because defenses are getting better, the less your attack capability is. We're getting better and better at defense, which reduces the ability to have the same level of attacking fighting power. Okay, so I can't resist one slide about the implications for the United States, actually 1.5, because the concluding slide is this too. But look, the world is getting more defensive is the argument. That's not comfortable for the United States. The United States, we have a strategy that's defensive. We say we like the status quo world order. We want it to stay the way it is. We don't want people to conquer each other. But the way that we carry that out, the way we execute our attempt to preserve the current distribution of territorial control in the world is offensive. So we plan to send forces close to the Chinese coast if we want to fight China, if we expect to fight China. We require, in order to do that, we're tempted constantly to defend our own forces sailing close to China. We don't want to just fire off defensive missiles to keep ourselves alive. We want to say, let's shoot the archer, not the arrow. Let's attack forces on the mainland in China just to keep ourselves alive, because our strategy is to go close to China. Well, that means we are attacking the other country, we say for defensive purposes, but it sure looks like an attack if you're the Chinese, right? And so that inconsistency between our strategic goals being defensive and our operations being offensive is getting worse and worse over time as technology shifts. It's getting more and more costly, more and more dangerous to sail close to China, threatening their land-based systems. It scares the Chinese, makes them build more, creates a tension between the United States and China over time. We really ought to switch to match to a defensive defense, to match our defensive strategy with a defensive operational concept that says, look, we just want to keep people from conquering Japan. We want to keep people from conquering Taiwan. We want to keep people away from our allies, so we can use the same technologies that are getting better and better to fend off potential invaders to our benefit, instead of right now where we have to fight into the teeth of Chinese defensive systems if the war ever happened. Why don't we make the Chinese fight into the teeth of our defensive systems? Well, right now we just don't have any defensive systems to speak of. But if we changed our emphasis to building defense instead of building these operationally offensive capabilities, we would take advantage of technology instead of fighting against technology. And I think we just have to remember that right now our whole way of thinking is premised on the idea that in order to deter someone from attacking you, you've got to be able to threaten to punish them for the attack. You threaten to hurt them. If they come after you, if China comes after Taiwan, we're going to hurt people in China until they stop. We're going to, attack Chinese cities, disrupt their economy, those kinds of things. that's not the only way to defend, right? Deterrence by punishment isn't the only kind of deterrence. China doesn't get excited about going on the offense and attacking if they think they're going to face withering attrition by fighting defensive systems that our allies deploy, right? So we can prevent China from going on the offense if you think China is inclined to go on the offense, which that's a debate in itself. But if you think China is inclined to go on the offense, we can keep them from doing it by promising that if they do it, it's going to be really costly and they're probably going to lose. And that's how to take advantage of the defensive trajectory instead of fighting it, which is what we currently do. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you, Eugene. I'm still trying to reconcile this road team advantage or home team advantage when we just experienced a World Series where the road team seemed to do very successful. I promised my daughter I'd get a Baby Shark reference in today. So, but Evan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Eugene's arguments and sort of its relevance to the Indo-Pacific or more broadly.
Sure. Well, thanks to both of you for hosting and having me, and to Eugene for the presentation. So most of my remarks are going to be about that last slide and a half, and responding to the defensive defense paper that was sent around, kind of fleshing those out.
So let me quickly say that defensive defense paper is going to be in the Washington Quarterly in the next issue. So.
Excellent. So, and which I look forward to it, and I certainly encourage everyone to read it when it comes out. I can remember being in a war game almost a decade ago, looking at the China military problem, when a number of people in the room sort of had this light bulb moment of proliferate friendly A2AD systems, build porcupines or hedgehogs or whatever animal that you want to pick, create a no man's sea in East Asia, and that would be one potential solution to the challenges we face with China. And that idea has caught on in some circles a little bit. It gets teased out here and there, and what the paper that'll be coming out really does that I like is it really pulls together and extends those ideas. It fleshes out a lot of implicit suggestions and really develops the implications. So it's really a fantastic piece that I violently disagree with in some ways, but that's what makes it fun to read. But it also tackles two big issues that I care about a lot, which is one, what is the range of defense strategy options under primacy, under the grand strategy of primacy? And two, what is the appropriate division of labor between the United States and its allies? So anyway, it's a fantastic piece and builds off this presentation. In terms of my, not violent disagreements, but mild disagreements, I'll talk about this briefly in terms of China, the United States, and then U.S. allies in the region, and where I think there are still some kind of open questions about this approach. So the paper, and you hinted this in your presentation, argues that China is, one, mainly pursuing anti-access area denial capabilities. That's the focus of its defense investment. And those capabilities are inherently or primarily defensive in nature. Right? And I think there is some truth to both of those assertions. Right? A2AD has clearly been a focal point for the PLA to date, and it's certainly useful for countering offensive operations on the part of the United States or anyone else in that region. But I do think both of those claims are a bit problematic in ways that underplay the dangers that China poses to the region, and that perhaps overstate its interest in preserving the status quo. So I'll highlight a few points here. First, we know China is investing heavily in traditional power projection capabilities, including blue water, surface naval assets, and amphibious forces. This is more traditional power projection, offensively oriented capabilities. Second, and this kind of gets to the distinguishability point, I think it's important to remember that A2AD systems can play an offensive role, especially as they're acquired in larger numbers, as they have longer ranges, and as they come with the supporting infrastructure to strike distant and even mobile targets. This raises some questions about their stabilizing effects, whether they're in the hands of China or other states in the region. So first, they can be used to support military coercion via the attempted disarmament of adversaries. Second, and you kind of hinted this in the paper a little bit, but I think it's an important point to draw out, they can be used in conjunction with traditional power projection assets to extend a zone of control. So essentially, land-based A2AD systems can be used in an offensive counter-air capability, which enables traditional power projection assets like surface naval forces to operate more freely. And then lastly, they create high first strike incentives, right? Although they're ostensibly defensive, the point of A2AD capabilities, especially longer range A2AD capabilities, is to catch an opponent's air forces while they're still on the ground and to catch as many of its naval forces as possible while they're still in port to maximize the amount of damage you can inflict. So that means striking first before your adversary, in this case the United States and its allies, has time to distribute its forces and reduce their vulnerability. Right? So these ostensibly defensive systems have some inherent offensive pressure that it's important to keep in mind. Finally, on this point, and this is an issue that I've wrestled with thinking about the role of friendly A2AD capabilities, and I think it's an important one. So the paper's emphasis and your argument's emphasis on China's A2AD systems seems to undercut the rationale for friendly A2AD systems a bit. So it's kind of an interesting tension. The anti-access area denial systems are mainly useful against power projection capabilities. That is the point, right? And that's why China is pursuing them in the first place. A2AD systems are not the best way to counter other A2AD systems. So this creates a tension that I'd be curious how you grapple with, that your recommendation is a solution to a problem that you suggest doesn't really exist. Right? So it's great to have A2AD capabilities in the hands of US allies, but if China doesn't have the power projection assets to threaten them in the first place, what good are those systems doing? Obviously, I think it's a more complicated story in reality, but that's certainly, again, one tension that I've wrestled with thinking about the rationale for these systems and what they would do. Let me turn briefly and talk about the US side of the equation, because one of the arguments that you make, both in your presentation and the paper, gets to the risk-reward calculus for the United States when it comes to its existing military approaches, particularly when it comes to, say, striking targets on mainland China in the event of a conflict. And you very correctly note, I think, that there are some challenges with this approach, to put it mildly. I would argue that the paper might overstate some of the downsides of a more offensive US approach and overlook some of the upsides. So I'll just talk about that very, very quickly. The three biggest downsides that you mentioned, I think everyone's familiar with, is that offensive operations are expensive, right? It's increasingly costly to get capabilities that can operate in denied environments. It fuels a security dilemma. It makes China nervous that it's going to be on the receiving end of an attack. And it raises the risk of nuclear use because you have this issue of entanglement and commingling of capabilities, and perhaps China might feel that its nuclear arsenal is coming under attack during a conventional conflict and decide to go nuclear in response. So first, I won't deny that projecting power in denied environments is a costly proposition. I would note that relying on standoff alternatives to support your allies, I don't think is necessarily cheaper at first blush. Right? So unless you scale back what you're trying to do, not just altering the tools you're using to achieve your missions, it's not clear to me that you're actually going to alter the cost curve in a way that makes a big difference. So that's point one. In terms of the security dilemma dynamics, my sense, I think it's increasingly clear to a lot of folks, although some people here might disagree, that China's defensive or its military investments are not simply a reaction to perceived threats by the United States, but they do reflect its own ambitions in the region and more broadly. And if that's the case, it's not clear to me whether adopting a more defensive approach on the US side will necessarily result in a reciprocal approach on the part of China. And lastly, in terms of the escalation dynamics, and this is obviously a bigger topic that we could have a whole nother session on, but I tend to think that concern is a little bit exaggerated, mainly because, one, there are a lot of steps, relatively simple steps, that China can take to reduce the pre-launch vulnerability of its nuclear forces. And there are very few reasons for a rational opponent to launch a nuclear strike against a state that has nuclear superiority. So to me, it's a pretty vanishingly small possibility that a conventional conflict with China would actually escalate to nuclear use. There are, I also think, three virtues to existing US approaches that you don't really talk about, but it's worth grappling with. Perhaps these are overstated, but I'll mention them. The first, and I think the most familiar one, is the assurance of allies issue. And in some ways, you have a paradox, I think, that's not really teased out in the paper, but it's worth discussing. On the one hand, you have allies who want you to adopt a more offensive approach because it assures them. On the other hand, as you note, they actually get a little squirrely about it when it comes time to, when the balloon goes up, so to speak. So there's a whole issue of dealing with allies there. I think two more important issues to address here. One, peacetime cost imposition. All right, if you essentially grant sanctuary to Chinese territory, you reduce the incentives they have to defend it and to spend money defending it, and that allows them to invest more in the offensive capabilities that you worry about in the first place. So in peacetime, there's a cost imposition benefit to holding targets like that at risk. The other point is wartime virtual attrition. I think everyone accepts that striking targets in a denied environment has been and will continue to be very difficult. China has, like any other state, advantages of operating on the land and taking advantage of concealment and camouflage and clutter, as you note. But the United States has some technological advantages. It has a reputation for solving some of these technological problems. And China, I think, as it's often put for us, has to honor the threat, right? And if they do view a threat to those forces, they have to, it reduces their freedom of action, and it forces them to operate in ways that can reduce the amount of force they project against regional adversaries or against the United States in a conflict. So there is another way of looking at the potential benefits you get, even if you aren't able to strike a target with as high level of confidence as you would hope. And lastly, and very briefly, I'll just talk about the ally piece of this. Certainly you've already seen Taiwan and Japan make moves in this direction, right, towards adopting friendly A2AD capabilities. But they've been sort of slow moves, right? They've been very reticent to do it, I think, on the Taiwan side. On the Japan side, there's been a lot of barriers to actually implementing this. I've seen PowerPoint slides for the last 5 years talking about this burgeoning southwestern wall in the Ryukyu Island chain, and I think it's finally starting to come into play a little bit, but it's been a slow process. So I'll just note that there are obviously a lot of barriers on the ally side. You suggest some ways of overcoming that in terms of how we can push them, and I think that's really interesting. But you have the bureaucratic barriers. You have the resource constraint barriers. You have some geographic and terrain issues, especially in the case of Japan, with some relatively small pieces of real estate in the Southwest Islands. And you have the regional reaction, which you have to take into account, I think. And there is a risk that by encouraging allies to develop some of these capabilities, which I don't think are viewed through a purely defensive lens, certainly not by China, you may dampen some security dilemmas, but heighten others, right? So there's another piece to this that I think needs to be thought out a little bit. But those are my comments. So
Fantastic.
love the paper.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Samir. And I enjoyed reading the paper that's going to come out on Washington Colony tremendously. I think it's going to generate a lot of attention in the region and probably bring about another round of debate about whether there will be a grand bargain and what that grand bargain will look like. So I'll put on my China hat and try to speculate how the Chinese would perceive this proposal, and also perhaps raise some questions about the end game that the proposal would bring about. So first of all, I think the Chinese will see this proposal or this position as extremely reasonable. And in fact, reading your paper, it did remind me of the debate about whether a few years ago, whether U.S. and China should have a deal about Taiwan. That maybe U.S. should concede some of the power and some of the postures in the West Pacific, and whether there should be a sphere of influence being divided between the two countries. And we have always seen that on the U.S. side, we have emphasized that as China's power grows, China deserves more consideration in terms of its reasonable interest and its reasonable security claims. But to this date, I haven't seen an elaboration as for what those reasonable rights or those reasonable national interests really constitute and how we should accommodate them. I think from the Chinese perspective, the region, the West Pacific, is regarded as the primary and the basic and the most fundamental theater of China's national security. So like what you just said, China sees that all its actions, or most of its actions in this area, in this theater, from the Chinese perspective, are defensive. They're not offensive. And they believe that this defensive nature is reasonable from the Chinese perspective. And when they look at it, because they see that the West Pacific is right at China's doorstep. And it's so far away from the United States homeland. So how could this not be reasonable from the Chinese perspective, right? And the Chinese at least see 4 issues from north to south in the West Pacific that could generate potential conflicts with the United States. And they are North Korea, East China Sea, Taiwan, and then South China Sea. But also from the Chinese perspective, on these 4 issues, one overarching theme is a competition between US and China in this region for leadership or for dominance. So in other words, what you mentioned in the paper, so these problems result from Washington's tendency to confuse its security needs with total military dominance of adversaries. But the question is, if US does not seek total dominance, how do we know that China does not seek it? And in other words, if our answer to China's pursuit of a more dominant role in the region is that we, United States and the allies, should adopt defensive A2AD posture, then does that equate to an acceptance or a concession to China of its regional dominance militarily? And that raises a lot of questions. First of all, how do we know? How do we make sure that China's intention is indeed defensive? Because China has always said that China's primary security threat is on its periphery, and especially the issue of national unification. And you will oftentimes hear Chinese strategists and military personnel would say that, well, China has not even achieved the national reunification. So how could we claim regional hegemony or global leadership role when we are not even unified? But then the hidden implied message here is kind of curious, because does that mean that after China achieves national reunification, then it will have fulfilled the basic qualification for regional hegemony or global leadership? Another example, so in the South China Sea, which everybody has talked a lot about, China claims that its weapon system deployed on the artificial islands are defensive in nature. And this intention or this desire to claim South China Sea as a defensive region for China's security basically can be traced back to the EP3 incident back in 2001, and how China sees a US military surveillance and reconnaissance so close to China's coastal line is a dire threat to China's national security, and China wants to push the US away from its coastal line. But in the Chinese design or in the Chinese vision, this type of actions of China in the South China Sea is not aimed at excluding US from the region. So they would say that, well, US is still welcome to come to the region, including US naval vessels. But also in the Chinese design or in their vision, US military activities in this region will have to be subject to the rules that China makes. So US can visit, but as a visitor, because US is not regarded or defined as an Asian power in the Chinese philosophy. So I would say that the issue of the South China Sea illustrates one problem, which is that China's definition of its defensive zone is expanding, and it has been expanding. And so far there's no indication that it will stop expanding, especially as its national power grows. So 20 years ago, we don't see China have this type of security demand in terms of South China Sea, but now it does. And currently, China has a naval supply center in Djibouti, and in the foreseeable future, China will be having more military bases overseas. So there's no indication, or there's very few indicators to say that China's eventual intention is not offensive. So if that is the case, then what should be our answer? Defensive defense, or where is that line really drawn? The second question that I have is when I look at this from the Chinese perspective, is that it's the issue of Taiwan. It's the overlapping zones between what the Chinese defines as their defense and what the U.S. will define as U.S. defense. So in the Chinese definition, Taiwan is a part of Chinese territory. So when they look at it, And if U.S. is indeed going to concede to the Chinese ability to defend the Chinese territory, then there will be some problems on the issue of Taiwan. Would that constitute defensive actions or offensive actions? So the feel that the inability to clearly divide the U.S. defense and the Chinese defense is going to create a problem. And furthermore, if U.S. does concede the ability to attack Chinese inland, Chinese territory, of course it will make China feel more assured. But it does not mean that China will believe that U.S. has abandoned its offensive intention towards China. Because in the Chinese context, U.S. alliance system in Northeast Asia and U.S. allies in Southeast Asia by themselves constitute what the Chinese see as the Asian version of NATO, aimed at containing China. And these are all part of the offensive arrangements targeted at China. So if we let China define what constitutes offense and defense, then I think China's demand will keep escalating. And last but not least, also on the allies, of course, encouraging or helping the allies to develop more A2AD system will help U.S. to decrease costs and also potentially mitigate some of the direct confrontation with China. But it's going to lead to some other problems. So, for example, if Japan's defense capability or Japan's military capability keeps escalating, it will directly raise Chinese concern about the remilitarization of Japan, which has been a key issue between China and Japan. And the increase of the Japanese capability will raise the Chinese fear and potentially escalate the regional arms race from that perspective. And on the other hand, if Taiwan's A2AT capability keeps increasing, and this will only lead to China continue to escalate its development of offensive capability against Taiwan. So other than the regional arms race, this could also lead to the effect of the regional allies losing their confidence in the U.S. leadership and the U.S. security assurance. And that could generate other sorts of problems in our calculation. But thank you very much. I think it's a great paper. I think it should be widely distributed and widely debated. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Eugene, I want to give you a chance to maybe address some of the things that are discussed and were brought up. I just wanted to throw a couple more ideas on the table. And I'm really wrestling with how I would apply some of your insights to the Indian Ocean in particular, because the geography is a little different. And so on the one hand, I think that at least how India sees things, I think I imagine a number of other states believe that China is trying to project power into the Indian Ocean. The string of pearls idea of creating bases and being able to leverage that to hold at risk other countries or their interests or shipping, whether through interdiction or direct attack, that will be sort of a form of Chinese power projection that is coming or is underway somehow, right? And so in that sense, your proposals for more sort of defensive defense seem like cost-efficient ways for states in the region that are concerned about this to counter, Chinese coercive capabilities. And in some ways, it doesn't quite create the no man's sea. It just sort of pushes out the contested zone because there is open geography in the Indian Ocean that's distinct from sort of the East China Sea or South China Sea. It's not as hemmed in, and so even the concerns about longer ranges that Evan talked about, that those could be effectively used for offense. In this case, you could make them; they would be much more defensively distinguishable because all you're doing is pushing out, ships to not being able to come in as close. So this seems like intuitive. It seems like a good idea. It probably solves a lot of concerns, I think, particularly that India is thinking about in terms of the cost curve, trying to modernize a navy that's mostly obsolescent or sort of veering toward obsolescence, and then also thinking about wrestling between sea denial versus sea control. I guess the thing that I start to wonder about now is if we get really into this idea of enabling and distributing A2AD systems or enabling other countries to develop them, how much does that limit our freedom of action? And we tend to want to go on the offense from time to time. We want to be able to sort of move our carriers close to the shores of Pakistan or India, not necessarily to deal with Pakistan and India, but to get to inland Central Asia, Afghanistan, and consistent with the restrainer sort of arguments about getting out of Afghanistan is the ability to be able to go back in. So are we at some point, is the proliferation of defensive capabilities, or quite exquisite, going to create problems for the U.S. operational concepts around the world, not just in East Asia? The second question I've been wondering about a little bit is, can you imagine technology in 10 years starting to shift the cost curve back towards offensive? So cheaper, dispersed, unmanned systems that can operate in swarms with lower risk to human life, at least on terms of the offender. Does that start to shift the cost curve back the other way, where they can just overwhelm defensive systems? I've heard people talk about this. I think it's fairly notional. I'm not really sure what the actual investments are in this stuff, but a lot of these things, like missile systems, can be placed on commercial ships that can be produced much cheaper, and then you could distribute them throughout the Pacific Ocean. They have longer ranges, and they could start to become, much more capable of overwhelming these defensive systems. Or maybe not. Maybe the land-based systems can equally replicate that and disperse them just as much. I'm not sure. But I wonder if we could throw a couple more of those wrinkles into the conversation. And I'll turn it over to you for maybe 5 minutes to take on all this, or none of it, just ignore it. And then we'll just open up the conversation.
I'm supposed to turn this on. I don't know if that helps or makes no difference. In any event, this is terrific, right? You get three smart people commenting from different angles on what are really two papers, right? There's the Washington Quarterly paper that's coming out that they talked about a good deal, and then there's a more academic paper about offense-defense theory that I also circulated to them, and they have different wrinkles in them. So I obviously can't engage with them. I thought they were terrific comments. They were really interesting, although it's interesting. They're sometimes inconsistent, and sometimes with each other, and sometimes inconsistent with themselves. I think I obviously think my arguments are smart. I think that Samir's key question dovetails nicely with one of the things Evan raised about the potential offensive capability of the technology trajectory, particularly if, with respect to, say, Taiwan, which is inside the engagement envelope of a lot of the systems that I brand as defensive Chinese systems, A2AD systems, right? They can fly far enough to hit targets on the Taiwanese mainland. So how are these defensive? They could just attack Taiwan with them. And I think and it gets to the point about putting missiles on commercial ships or swarms. Could you overwhelm the defenses that way? And I think the key answer to both of these things is the point I was trying to make about the difference between land versus sea and air. That I think systems are fundamentally more survivable, not on tiny land, not on the human-built islands, fake islands on features in the South China Sea, which are too small to offer cover and concealment and much mobility and can't be resupplied. Right? These are inherently very weak militarily. We should basically ignore them. But Taiwan is a lot bigger than that. And you can drive around and you can hide behind hills, and there's a giant mountain in the middle of it. And there are a whole bunch of features you could take advantage of that fundamentally mean that A2AD systems that are good at hitting things on the water or in the air are not good at hitting things on the land. You would want to use different sensor technologies, different wavelengths of radars. Even after you did, you can't clear all the clutter on the land. You can't get around the greater ability to seek cover and concealment on land than on the water, right? There is no, sure, you can build more offensive systems that try to attack the fixed defense, or not fixed, the mobile defenses on Taiwan or in the Ryukyus or wherever we are talking about putting them. Great. You can build lots more, but every one of those additional things you build is less likely to achieve its military objective and is more expensive than the system you are shooting at, that is the defensive system designed to hit things on the water or in the air as opposed to on the land. So your cost trade-off in doing that is bad, and your effectiveness trade-off in doing that is bad. So the swarms, you could build a swarm of things intended to attack on the land, but the land-based countermeasures against that swarm are more effective and cheaper than building the swarm itself. And so China's always going to lose that race. Now, China's rich. Like, they can keep trying to race ahead, and I think they probably would. If Taiwan defended itself better, China would be committed to saying, no, this is reunification of China. We're going to spend what we have to spend to stay in this game. But this is a cost-imposing strategy on China by making them compete with the defensive capabilities that are cheaper on a, in that race and more effective in that race. China would have to build much, much more to overcome robust defenses than right now. We're making it easy for them because we are the ones building our offensive defense that flies into the face of the technology trajectory. Right? We're building more air and naval systems. And so we're making it expensive on ourselves. We should make it expensive on them. It's kind of the general, think about how the technologies work and what it says about cost-imposing strategies or about who's likely to win the ultimate race, if there is an arms race. So if I only get 5 minutes, I think that's the big thing I want to say about Samir and Evan's comments. There's lots of interesting things and lots of other things I would love to, we're going to get to talk more, so there it is. Yun's comments are also very interesting because she highlights that, look, the Chinese might think this is very reasonable because we're threatening them less, or we appear to be threatening them less. They will still see some residual capability in the United States that threatens them, so they're not going to be completely assuaged, just like no country is ever completely assuaged from the possibility that somebody could hurt them. There's no pure, perfect nirvana, at least in this world, right? But it could be a lot closer than where we are. Like, China could be less afraid. And would China keep building out and seeking more aggressive capability? Well, remember, this proposal is not about saying, oh, China gets to take Taiwan, or China gets to take Japan, or we're going to just leave Asia to China. This is about a better way of defending Asia, a way that's more likely to work, less likely to lead to spirals of hostility, less expensive. But nobody's talking about, sure, China gets some amount of respect as a meaningful military power because we just have to recognize the reality that what we're currently doing is expensive and dangerous. Inherently, recognizing that China has the ability to make us do something expensive and dangerous, that's giving them a certain amount of respect. But we're not giving them any respect that says, and because of that, you get to rule other countries, or you get to push other people around, right? We're still going to, would support the capabilities of the status quo countries that we're friends with in Asia, right? So China needs to build some A2AD capability, or not China, the allies need to build some A2AD capability because China has some inherent offensive capability, right? So you need to defend against that. And if China wants to race by building more offensive capability, we'd have to build, or our side, whatever that is, would have to build more defenses. But the good news is we would be on the more effective and cheaper side of the arms race as opposed to on the more expensive, more dangerous, and less effective side of the arms race, right? So this is a way, no one's saying China gets to rule Asia. Every country gets self-determination or whatever, and we can talk about what it means. I'm not an expert on this. I just want to recognize reality, which is currently Taiwan is self-ruling. And whether that's a long-run thing or whatever, politically, it's not my area. You guys can probably have a heated debate about that. But just the reality is that if China decides they want to be more aggressive, I would rather be working with technology on a defensive defense and making China have an offensive offense, right? Because we're now positing that China is offensive, not defensive. I want to make it as costly as possible, and I want to have the best chance to defend against China if China is actually offensive. And to do that, that's to recognize the technology trajectory and have a defensive defense, not an offensive defense on our side.
Okay, so we've got a lot of thought-provoking stuff on the table. We'll take some questions, just some rules of the road. First of all, wait for the microphone to come to you so we can get this recorded for the video and live stream. Second, please introduce yourself and affiliation before you ask your question. Third, ask a question, not make a statement. If you're going to make a statement, find a creative way to ask it in the form of a question.
What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. One question also as well. So, all right, so let's start here, and then we'll just work our way around the room.
Hi, Dave Newsom, U.S. Air Force Regional Plans and Posture. I actually work Indo-Pacific issues. 2 questions. I'll keep them short. What is the right balance in terms of forward posture of our forces, specifically in the first and second island chain, when we're looking at this A2AD dilemma? Now, looking at the point of having allies by their own A2AD defenses may help offset that, and then relying more on standoff forces, bombers further back. But what about forward presence, to be there to reassure allies and partners? Because to some extent, they may see us as abandoning. So it's all in a balance. I just want to get your thoughts on that. My second question is a horizontal escalation. Could be a Taiwan scenario, East China Sea, South China Sea scenario. What's your perspective about raising the cost by horizontally escalating a crisis, say, Indian Ocean, Straits of Malaccas, maybe with India?
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Great. So why don't you take first crack at that, and we'll give our discussants an opportunity as well.
Sure. So you could do this a lot of different ways. So the horizontal escalation thing, I think I'll just be very quick about. I think it's kind of nutty. I mean, this is something that people explored in the Cold War, right? If the Soviets attack in the Fulda Gap and try to take Germany, the only way to really balance that is to take something of theirs. We should go on the offense and try to take Prague. I mean, this just struck me as like they're doing something super hard and super costly and attrition laden, so we should too. That doesn't sound right to me. Like if the offense is hard, let's try not to do it. And so the idea of horizontally escalating and making crises worse and trying to expand it where we're on the offense just sounds dangerous to me. That's my perspective. And also, we also could lose because the offense is hard. So that's one point. Now, the other point about the balance of what our allies do, what do we do, what's the standoff capability, how do you do reassurance? Look, if I had my druthers, the advantage is in land-based capability, right? So we could develop a bunch of ships that sit east of Taiwan, outside the Chinese A2AD engagement envelope, that then put anti-ship cruise missiles into the Taiwan Strait that would stop a Chinese amphibious attack. That has all the problems that ships have, not the problems of now we're sailing into their A2AD envelope and they'll sink our ship, but the limited rate of fire, the limited magazine and reload capability. I mean, they're stuck on a ship and it's small and they can't easily move to get new lines of attack. They don't have the broad spectrum sensors. Like you could do some planning in advance that helped improve your sensor capability, but you're still stuck in the constrained space of fighting with come as you are, as opposed to having warehouses full of munitions and many, many different sensors and many, many different launch points. And so the real way to do this is not to have lots of standoff capability for the United States, and have lots of land-based stuff in the Allies. And then you have the question of, is it better or worse to have that be American stuff or the indigenous Allied stuff? And so if the United States decided to reopen a bunch of military bases in Taiwan to defend Taiwan with effective land-based forces, holy crap, we would have a big diplomatic incident, right? The Chinese would be pissy. And for totally understandable reasons, right? So like, I would much prefer not to encourage that, right? So I would prefer to say, look, we're committed to Taiwan's freedom as much as Taiwan is committed to Taiwan's freedom. We'll write you a check. If instead of spending $20 billion on an aircraft carrier and its airplanes, I'm going to not buy that power projection force this year, and instead, I'm going to take $10 billion of that and write a check to Taiwan to buy mobile anti-ship cruise missiles that are land-based and will be in the Taiwanese military. I'll give them military aid. And then I'll save the other $10 billion. right? So now I'm better off, the world is safer, and Taiwan can defend itself, but I haven't created a huge diplomatic incident by having US forces take the lead on the A2AD defense of Taiwan. I could do the same thing, it would make the Japanese feel more comfortable. All of these things in, you know, I would want to show commitment, reassure, yes, we care about your freedom, we're on your team. You got to also buck up and do your share. We'll help you pay so that China can't just overwhelm you. But you're the ones fighting at the front line, not us, because we have this technology-driven disadvantage in the fight.
Either of you want to take on some of this stuff? Also the assurance question, or reassurance question?
Sure. So just on the horizontal escalation and blockade, I think it's an appealing argument. I think there are a lot of problems with getting about this blockade. I think blockade is your backup plan. Right? That's not something you lead with. At the end of the day, you can always default to that option.
But then take Taiwan by the time you're doing it, so you're not mad.
It may be a mood issue, but it is a latent option that you always have. It is not the one that you should be doing. In terms of what the right balance is in terms of forward presence versus standoff or U.S. and allied, I mean, it's a bit hacky to say now, but combat credible forward presence, right? And to a degree, we sort of know what that looks like. There's not a ton you can do on the maritime side, and you're sort of tied to the ships you have, and their access to ports. There's some things you can do to improve it, but maybe not a ton. On the air side, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of reducing base vulnerability, and I think everyone's had that roadmap for a decade or more. It's just a question of putting the resources toward it and getting the political capital to do it on foreign territory. And the other is this issue that's now cropped up in terms of land-based missile forces, right? That for all the reasons that you laid out, that there are some survivability and lethality virtues to having land-based missile forces, especially now that the United States is out of the INF treaty. Can you use that capability and have forward-based or forward station land-based anti-ship or strike capability in East Asia? The issue there.
The strike part.
Debate that one over lunch.
Yeah.
But I think the issue there is just remember it is likely to be a niche capability, right? So it can serve it can serve the role of assurance. I think it can help in potential conflicts in a variety of ways, especially the outset for a lot of the other assets vulnerable. But I think it's not a capability that you're likely to have on the U.S. side or the Allied side in mass for a variety of reasons, resource, political, et cetera. So I think it helps as part of the equation, but it's a supplement, not a replacement for existing forces.
All right, well, I don't know if we got an answer to the assurance question. I just wanted to throw out a line that a friend of mine mentioned at one point, which is it feels at times it can be like the black hole of international politics where there's never enough you can do to fulfill or fill assurance demands.
And it's true. I mean, no ally is ever fully assured.
Yeah.
We all know that. But I will say this on the land-based forces, they do have the virtue of not being as removable
Yeah.
as your air and naval assets.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's something uniquely assuring potentially about land-based forces in that regard. Once they're
mobile.
there,
Air base is not mobile.
an air base is not mobile, but the aircraft can pull out and withdraw and might have to. The surface ships might have to pull back, and they might have to, at least at the outset. Your land-based forces are a fight-in-place force, and that has assurance value if you play it.
And if they're you're talking, ballistic and cruise missiles all up to the, INF treaty being presented, they're mobile, most likely, so you can move around. So there's ability to have some exception there.
All right, so we've chewed up a lot of time. I want to make sure we get lots of questions in, so I'm going to take two at a time this one. So I saw a gentleman back there, and then we'll go to you, sir.
I had two questions, but I'll limit to one. What does resupply and logistics look like through the no man's sea? And what does that mean for a protracted, drawn-out fight?
Great, and hold that, and we'll just take another question here.
Yeah, Pat Towell, Congressional Research Service. This is maybe a nuance, but you've been emphasizing in the limitations of air and sea platforms, they're volume limited. They're also inherently more fragile. You punch a hole in an airplane, it's probably a problem. You punch a hole in a ship, it might be a problem. You punch a hole in the ground, you got a hole in the ground.
Yeah.
So that, that's a part of it.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is a good point.
Recovery time, yeah.
Yeah, right. So recovery time is another way to think about it. All that, I mean, that's right. There have been a bunch of observations about both the relative vulnerability and there's a big debate in the United States about a concept again, more than a decade ago called the Arsenal ship, was going to be a cheap ship with a whole lot of missiles in it that would give you many strategic options, right, given the way we were starting to think about network-centric warfare and those kinds of things. But one of the, we didn't build it in the end. One of the important critiques of it was it's an incredibly valuable thing if you sink it, right? The trade-off, you use, 5 missiles to take out this ship and you get hundreds of missiles poof off the table from the other side. So that level of vulnerability, rather than being able to distribute forces on land, makes a huge difference. Resupply in No Man's Sea. I mean, No Man's Sea. If you imagine, right, the analogy No Man's Sea is meant to make you think of No Man's Land. I don't know how many of you saw War Horse or the recent movie that Peter Jackson made using the old. I can't remember the name of it. It was a
They Shall
terrific
Not Be
movie.
Forgotten.
They Shall Not Be Forgotten.
Yeah.
Right.
World War
He colorized and did these incredible restorations of World War I battlefield footage. You're not resupplying someone in the killing zone, right? I mean, it's just ugly. So, in peacetime, people sail, commercial ships, whatever, no problem. But No Man's Sea is a place where you don't want to be if you're in the war. So, in an actual wartime scenario. So, if ideally, what you'd like is huge amounts of distributed, adequate distributed defensive forces on the land before things fight. It is also the case that if you take advantage of geography and you're avoiding Chinese power projection by sinking it if they try to leave ports in China, there are potential resupply routes that are, protected from, Chinese radars and targeting capabilities from the east side into either Taiwan or Japan that would allow, we could have some amount of resupply if we needed to, if we wanted to, from the United States into these fighting regions to keep them shooting out if we were careful and were willing to take some risks because it's a war. So I don't think it's entirely hopeless. But the idea of continuing to supply into that area of the A2AD envelope where the other guy has sensor capabilities, I think we've got to get past that. Like, that's what we have assumed for the last 30 years, and that's dangerous.
Any other? Oh, Yoon, I wanted to ask a quick question of you. If we flip this for a moment, and what is your sense of how Chinese thinkers, scholars, military strategists have been thinking about this offense-defense balance and whether and how it affects China's ambitions or power projections, or beyond its shores, and even beyond East China Sea and South China Sea? Like, there is some sort of latent network being built up in the Indian Ocean, whether it's sort of haphazard or intentional, and some people suspect it to be sort of, for offensive purposes. Are they starting to reconcile with this, the prospect that, it'll be much more expensive and difficult to have carrier battle groups operating in the Indian Ocean and asserting their own interests? Or is that sort of, that conversation hasn't even started yet?
Well, this conversation has started and is regarded as what the Chinese will call 大国标配. So it's a standard configuration for a great power. So I think looking down the road, when China sees itself as a rising global power with global presence, those equipments and those capabilities will be required, and it's not really a question of expense. And just similar like the question of Taiwan, I think the cost imposing, of course, is desirable from our perspective. But from the Chinese perspective, national reunification does not have a price tag to it.
Yeah. Sure.
So when you take that into consideration, the cost imposing, especially in the Chinese preparation for the offensive offense, is not necessarily prohibitive. And then coming back to Samir's question about the Chinese deployment and their capabilities they're developing in the Indian Ocean, I think, like I mentioned, the primary theater of China's goal in terms of its military operations is still focused on the West Pacific. So Indian Ocean is regarded as tertiary and secondary. Is China going there? Yes, they are. Between 2013 to 2017, Chinese submarines, including nuke submarines, has entered the Indian Ocean for at least 8 times that they officially recognize. So they are going to operate in those zones, but it's not because they want to take it over for the time being. But then again, the Chinese definition of the core areas that they need to protect is also expanding. With China Belt and Road, China has massive investment and assets and personnel in these regions. That's going to increase their demand for capabilities, both defensive and offensive.
Let me just say about that. I mean, it's quite possible that China wants to operate in the Indian Ocean, and they have been, in peacetime, sending limited forces there, right? They're showing they're interested in a global presence. If people want to fight away from homeland, it doesn't have to be homeland. So, like, Russia can deploy air defenses to Syria and develop an A2AD network in Syria. So it's like from the land. If people want to go, if China wants to go into the Indian Ocean, all these advantages of A2AD are gone, right? So they're now bringing a vulnerable ship with it can only bring its own capabilities with it. Its defenses and offense both come with it. It has the sensor limitations and the magazine limitations, all of those things. It's on the same, at best, it's on the same plane as the American Blue Water Fleet, right? But China's sending one submarine into the Indian Ocean in wartime. Submarine is relatively unprotected. New sensors that are good at sonars and understanding the bathymetry and all of these things of deep water are just going to get that submarine sunk, right? If China wants to build a carrier strike group that's meaningful and try to sail it into the Indian Ocean, if it's in a war with the United States, it can only do that kind of at U.S. forbearance or U.S. permission, as long as we have command of the comments, right? So not the contested zones that are inside somebody's A2AD envelope, but in the blue water, where we have, depending how you count, something like a dozen strike groups plus a bunch of other action groups that are not the main carrier strike groups. Like, China's not on the scale of competing with that in the blue water. Now, if we allowed them to sail in and they wanted to joust with India, right? Now they're kind of on the same footing, but if they go into India's A2AD envelope, they're in big trouble. But if they stay in the deep water of the Indian Ocean, now it's Indian power projection force against Chinese power projection force on whatever the equal footing or not equal footing, looking at who's better, who's been spending more. Like, this is very speculative decades down the line of how can multiple small navies compete inside the overarching global system, which is U.S. command of the comments.
I still think the most powerful navy in the Indian Ocean is still the United States by
Oh,
far. Yeah. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes, and we'll take sort of 3 questions as quickly as possible. So start with this gentleman here, and then anyone else. I saw someone at the back. Okay, so if there's one more, you can jump in, but why don't you wait for the mic?
Okay. Good morning still. No, afternoon now. Anyways, no, morning. My watch is wrong. So I have a question. One of the
Can you introduce
traditional...
yourself real quick?
Sorry?
Can you introduce
Oh,
yourself?
yes. Griffin Cannon, just graduated Notre Dame. I worked with Professor Gholz there. One of the traditional defenses navalists will put forward to this is the advantage of a blue water fleet is maneuver, right? You can go anywhere you want. The same force that they're going to have to defend against everywhere you go, right? So they're going to have to build the missile batteries, the A2AD systems, every potential place that you can be going with this naval force. Why is that less true now than it used to be? How does the cost exchange ratio work here? Why is that not an adequate defense for maneuver forces as opposed to A2AD? Thank you.
All right, Blue Water Navy, and just wait for the mic. There we go.
There's another one.
Thank you. Libo Liu, VOA. If Yun is correct that the Chinese may not care too much about cost imposing tactic, because if they're determined this is their unification, national unification priority, then what would be the U.S. response? Because in democratic countries like the U.S., cost matters and it's a national concern. So that would be a question for Eugene and Evan. Thanks.
I think you want to ask. Well, let's get this gentleman here in the front, and then we'll give everyone on the panel a chance for final remarks and responses.
David Little. My question is about if China looks at Taiwan as being the ultimate goal right now. I mean, and they're willing to spend anything to get Taiwan. Couldn't we use that against them as far as having them spend so much of their their GDP, that it becomes prohibitive or against them. It works against them in the long run economically. So that's it.
Cost imposing strategy. All right, so let's. Do you want to start? And we'll just go down the line. Final thoughts overall
Yeah.
and responses.
So I view this kind of as two groups of questions, since the second two are similar. Griffin's question about the maneuverability of the fleet. So one thing that's true about modern sensors and data processing capability is getting lost in the great expanse of the ocean is less possible than it used to be in the past. Surveillance is getting better. Now, knowing where everything is, like we had this crazy idea of maritime domain awareness in the United States over the last 20 years, of thinking that we're going to know about what's on every ship everywhere to prevent terrorists from sneaking weapons into the United States or whatever. And it's just too complicated, right? The data requirements, the amount of stuff that happens on the oceans is still too huge. But it's getting easier. We're getting better at handling this kind of stuff. So the value of hiding and maneuverability, and they don't know exactly where we're coming from, the trajectory is that's going down. The other problem is we're in the strategic defense, not the strategic offense, right? So there are specific points geographically that everybody knows that's what we want to defend. And so we don't get the full advantage of the flexibility of the fleet can sail anywhere, because everybody knows the fleet's defending Taiwan or the fleet's defending Japan. You could get into wacky horizontal escalation kinds of things where you say the best way to defend Taiwan is to attack in the Persian Gulf. I think everyone knows that we're constrained. And so we don't have that kind of flexibility operationally that I think you're hoping for. With respect to what do we do if China is just committed to spending as much as it takes to get Taiwan, well, I think this gentleman's question is partly the answer to that, which is, sure, countries can unhinge themselves by overspending on defense, and we've seen some countries do that in history. And if that's the choice the Chinese want to make, it's not the choice I would make, but I don't advise the Chinese government. I don't want to be the Chinese government. I leave that up to them. I think, we can choose, and similarly, it's up to the Taiwanese to decide how much they value, or the Japanese or anybody else, how much they value, different levels of autonomy and independence, and how much they want to commit to their own defense, and whether they want, as the Chinese spend more and more, whether they want to keep up their end of the race. Like every country has to decide, would we rather maintain our freedom or not? It's costly to maintain our freedom. And different countries face different levels of threat, and you're positing a circumstance where the Chinese might be posing quite a large threat, a larger threat in the future to Taiwan than they have posed in the past, other than the kind of ideological, intellectual, economic, maybe the Taiwanese don't, maybe you convince Taiwan not to care about being independent, right? That's what's been going on for the last 20 years. Maybe that'll change in a military competition, but that all just seems inevitable, right? Like, that's not the question is not, it is an interesting question for sinologists, which I'm not one, and I tend to distrust people who tell you they can think like another country. But if you believe, there's one question, should you really believe China is implacably committed, no matter what, to spending as much as it takes to having the capability to conquer Taiwan? Or should you believe that China takes a reasonable, very long view about the attractiveness of being part of mainland China, and you don't need a military solution to this problem? And there are different things that you could decide from the perspective of understanding Chinese intentions. I just want to set aside that whole conversation, right? It's not my conversation. I'm distrustful of those people, but that's an important debate. I just want to think about, well, if China has the long view and doesn't want to build a lot of offensive forces, is it better for the United States to have an offensive defense or a defensive defense? The answer is a defensive defense. If, on the other hand, China is implacably aggressive and no matter what is going to spend what it takes to develop a capability to conquer Taiwan, I need to decide now, what's the right US response to that? Is it an offensive defense or a defensive defense? And because of the way technology is going and because of the way geography works in this region, it's clear to me the answer is a defensive defense. So in a sense, I don't care about the answer to Chinese intentions. I care about technology and military capabilities that say no matter what, given the current circumstances, I choose defensive defense.
Okay, that's comprehensive. Evan?
Sorry.
Sure. So just on the cost issue, I'll answer the two questions with two questions that I don't have a good answer to, but that come to my mind. First, there's an issue of how much can both sides sustain over the long run. The United States has a very large defense budget. It also spends a very small portion of GDP on defense. China has a large and growing defense budget, but I think there are some open questions about the strength and resilience of the Chinese economy over the long run. So that's something else we have to kind of factor in. The second piece on cost is, to the extent that we can actually shape what China spends its money on and what defense investments it makes, there is a question about whether you want it to be regionally focused on Taiwan, for example, and focus its efforts there, or whether you want it to focus its efforts on global power projection capabilities, right? Do you want it to be concentrated or dispersed? And they both have arguments in favor and against in terms of how that would play into our strategy and how it would help the United States or harm the United States.
On the issue of Taiwan, I'll just say that, well, the issue of national unification is important for China, not just because it's an issue of territorial integrity and historical agony, but it's also an issue of regime security. And coming to regime security, there's also, again, no price tag. I would say that if U.S. does decide to support Taiwan in every single way that is possible, regardless of the cost, it probably will prompt China to take preemptive steps to achieve their goals before all the U.S. investment or the U.S. arrangement are in place. And how much we're willing to spend also depends on the issue of prioritization. For China, there's no bigger priority than Taiwan, than national unification. But do we see Taiwan as such a high-level priority issue for our national defense? And for a very long time, well, basically starting from 1970s, U.S. policy towards Taiwan is hinged upon strategic ambiguity. It's a deliberate and intentional avoidance to taking a position as for whether we support Taiwan independence. But if we are making a commitment that we're going to support Taiwan no matter what, regardless of the cost, then that will basically abandon the strategic ambiguity. That is to say that, okay, we support Taiwan independence and we're willing to come to Taiwan's defense. So I'm not sure if the abandonment of that policy is currently considered an option.
Interesting. Well, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. I've learned a lot during the debate back and forth. So thank you, Eugene, for presenting the arguments. Thank you to Evan and Yun for fantastic discussion comments. And hopefully we'll be doing more of this in the future. So thanks all for joining us.